Carolina, thanks very much for that. Very practical, very passionate. Carolina mentioned the JP Morgan Week. Japan Society of Northern California actually is a host of one of those receptions. It's called Japan Night. And if you're interested in going, if you're going to be in San Francisco, please let me know, and I'll get you invited to that Japan Night reception. And a special offer just for the people in this room for being here today. We'll also pass your name on to some of our corporate members who do slightly larger, more luxurious parties and receptions. People like Morgan Lewis and some of the other law firms, Oric. If you'd like to, we can't guarantee you'll get invited, but we're happy to send them over to them as well. And that stands a pretty good chance of getting invited. So just let me know if you're going to be in San Francisco, and we'll hook you up. Speaking of Oric, gives me the opportunity to also say special thanks to Hiroki Sugita of Oric, who's also a partner and supporter of this program today. So again, thanks to Oric. Where's there he is, Hiroki. So next workshop, we have one more workshop before the break, so hang in there. It's on fundraising, a very, very important issue. And so, and Chris Godbod, who has been introduced before, is going to be leading that. So Chris, please.
Hiroki-san, if you can join me.
So thank you very much, everyone, for having me today. And I know everyone's gonna get tired a little bit, So let's get a stretch a little bit, everyone. Let's get a stretch. Let's yawn. Relax. Okay, so I think we're ready, right? So thank you very much for having me today. So I'm really excited to have this presentation together with Chris. So before getting started, let me introduce briefly about myself and on Oric. So my name is Hiroki Sugita. I'm a corporate partner based in Tokyo and of the law firm called Oric. I grew up in Japan for the entire life. So I spent a little bit of time in France, and then I did a foreign exchange student in Ohio, United States, when I was in high school. Then I returned to US again to finish my LLM at Columbia. So that's kind of, then my career has been always with the international law firm. So with John Zay and moved to Melvin, and Oric is my third firm. And my practice area is basically, I focus on corporate stuff, but always cross-border M&A or cross-border venture capital, which, we talk about today, or cross-border licensing stuff as well. So here, how can I move in? Oh, here, maybe. Okay, thank you. So brief about Oric. So Oric is an international law firm starting from San Francisco 150 years ago, but we have now 27 offices across the globe, including Europe and Asia and US with around 1,400 lawyers. So Tokyo office has around 20 lawyers in different areas. So I'm heading the corporate group here. And in terms of technologies, one of the kind of core practice of Oric. So we kind of assist all the entrepreneurship from the beginning to the unicorn, or even after they go IPO as a public company. So here's a kind of list of key clients. And in terms of life science, we cover variety of the practice group. So we also do a lot of IP litigation involving pharmaceutical, and also just the licensing stuff Carolina mentioned. And also we do venture capital stuff. And more recently, we focus on the cybersecurity, which is becoming a big issue for pharmaceutical companies. And as Caroline mentioned, so we also hosting at the JP Morgan event in the beginning of January. So please let me know if you're planning to come. I know, just give me some cards. I'll make sure you get the invitation. But I mean, like you said, it's free that you can enjoy, but don't drink too much, right? Okay. So with that, before getting to the real presentation, which is going to be led by Chris, I just want to give some example in terms of kind of successful fundraising for the biotech company using an example, one of the Japanese startups, which is also one of our clients. So the company called Lucas Science, and in doing so, I think I'm going to touch upon like 4 key elements to make a successful funding round, especially from the global investors, and which you will come back to later. Come back to Chris' point. So he's gonna kind of walk you through more detail. So Lucas Science is a preclinical mitochondria platform company. So they came up with a very novel method of creating just a storable off-the-shelf mitochondria, which can convey all kinds of different drugs as a kind of agent. So like all the people in the panel agreed, we have a very strong science here. And so how the company started was starting from an NPO Koinobori, which is primarily focusing on finding the way to cure the mitochondrial disease, which is a rare disease. And one of the key members, the child, was diagnosed as having the mitochondrial disease. But that's how they started. But through development, they find this novel method of delivery of the functional mitochondria. So then, in terms of because it's a platform company, so there's a lot of potential of the market. So of course, they're still focusing on mitochondrial disease, but also like in terms of oncology, cards, or all kind of different stuff, or eventually in the future, they may be able to apply these technologies, for example, anti-aging technology, because mitochondria basically is the help you to kind of, carry all the energy to the cells. So that's the market side. The third point is the team. So if you look at 5 kind of key members here, it's interesting. So Koinobori was originally founded by Professor Suganuma on the right-hand side. So he founded the company first, and he took a CEO position. But I guess Chris may mention it later, but the team evolves over time, right? So what happened was before getting Series A round from the investor, so they invited Rick Tsai, who's a Taiwanese national, but he's been educating working for whole life. And he was heading the medical affair of MSD, Japan side at that point. So he was introduced to this company. So he took a position CEO. Then the company was able to get a successful Series A round, including from like a kind of investor, which included some of the panel like Axel Capital or Remiges. And then they brought up more people, which is more international background. For example, Tokuoka-san, the CFO, is originally from PwC, but he also graduated from Purdue, and also brought the head of CMC and head of R&D. So then, if you look at the last part, the co-investors in the board, so at the Series A round, you get Axel Capital, Remiges, and FDI. All they have both kind of footprint both in Japan and US. And the further at the B round, they are able to bring other international ventures, like including FDI Ovidiu as well, and 4Bio, which is a UK based venture capital. So if you look at the kind of history, so in 2020, they closed the Series A, and followed by the Series B in 2022, and more recently, so the company is now recognized as one of the most 10 Japanese emerging deep tech company by Forbes. So again, science, market, and team, and investors. With that, I would like to turn to the main part to Chris. Here you go.
Thank you, Hiroki-san, and thank you everyone for joining us today for BioJent and OviBees for the invitation. As mentioned earlier, my name is Christopher Godbon. I'm a principal at Alix Ventures, a San Francisco-based early stage platform life science firm. We invest in companies from the pre-seed to the Series A. I'm also a co-founder of the life science community organization OneBio with Anastasia here, who was kind enough to join us. First and foremost, before we get started, and this touches on Hiroki-san's presentation and the story of Luca, as well as something that Carolina said and really emphasized, there's one point I really want to make. If you take nothing else away from today's presentations, remember that your story is the most important. It's what gets your foot in the door with investors, and having a story that gives someone an understanding of who you are, what you're doing, and why it matters, and being able to do that in 1 to 2 sentences, in 90 seconds, over the span of a 20-minute presentation, or in an elevator, all of that makes a really significant difference to ensuring that you can really engage with investors. Because every day I receive over 1,000 notifications. And so how am I going to make sure that I understand who you are and what you do? It's your story that tells me that. But let's get started. By way of a brief background, so you have a sense of who I am and why I'm speaking with you. I was an undergraduate in chemical engineering at Tufts University in Massachusetts, where I founded a synthetic biology organization. I then got my master's in bioengineering with a focus in cell and bioprocess engineering, doing work in the early stage drug development space with protein small molecule hybrids, before founding a boutique consultancy to advise over 24 early stage startups. I took that experience and went into AstraZeneca, where I helped oversee the oncology clinical trial practice before helping build what's known as the Emerging Innovations Unit, where we had a very venture-like role doing search and evaluation, business development, and innovation strategy work. After doing that for a couple years, I got my MBA at Wharton and then joined Alix Ventures, where, as I mentioned, I run our early stage investment practice and where I've spent the last 3 years helping build the firm. So today, I'm going to take my experience as a founder in pharma, in consulting, and in venture to talk a little bit about biotech fundraising. Let's briefly first set the stage and talk about the financial landscape in the US, as well as the types of investors, types of funding. From there, let's talk about the different elements that investors consider, and Hiroki-san summarized them well: team, market, science, other investors. And then let's also talk about ways you can increase your chances of success in getting funding. Starting with a biotech financing overview, the main question we want to ask ourselves is, what are the different models of biotech financing and how do these models differ? What differentiates bio from other industries? And most importantly, what are the differences between early stage investing and late stage investing? And what have been recent changes in the biotech fundraising landscape? So starting things off, let's talk about how we classify investors. Investors in the early stage, and you were hearing about this earlier, typically fall into 2 categories. There are those that do venture creation, building companies themselves, or in conjunction with entrepreneurs or academics. And then there are those that directly invest into startups that have been founded by others. In the late stage space, these are similarly direct investors. And the primary difference, and there's some flexibility in this, early stage investors are typically pre-seed to Series A, maybe Series B, whereas later stage investors are Series B to crossover, though nowadays there are also a large number of firms who will invest both in the private and the public space together. As we think about classifying the investments themselves, at the early stage space, investments are largely driven based on the team and the potential, with the support of the proof of concept science and the intellectual property behind it. And then at the late stage, as you get later and later, your investments are primarily and increasingly driven by validation. Clinical validation, potentially partnership validation with pharmaceutical companies, as well as the financial potential of the market. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of these. As we set the stage, let's take a couple years back and talk about how with COVID and the increased interest in healthcare, there was a massive increase in investment with the number of companies increasing by about half and the amount of money raised by those companies over doubling. There was a huge amount of LP interest in the space, And there was also a large amount as a result of investor interest from people who historically haven't had deep biotech expertise. Now, with the economic downturn, a number of those investors have pulled back. And so it's going to be important to think about that as you consider who is on your board. Do you want this sort of tourist capital that is willing to give you money, but doesn't necessarily know to stick by you or can't necessarily provide real value as a knowledgeable investor? It's a point to consider. But, and more importantly for today, it's now become a lot easier to raise money from investors outside your immediate geographic area. That said, while there was a huge increase in investment during COVID and shortly thereafter, with the economic downturn, there have been some changes. Today, this is summary data from the first half of 2023 that I compiled with John Norris, who leads the healthcare practice at HSBC, the world's third largest bank. He leads their early stage healthcare practice. We're seeing an over 30% decrease in investment from last year and over 60% from 2021. There are also fewer deals, but despite that, over $23 billion was invested in the first half of this year and almost 1,300 deals in the US alone. In addition to that, as we consider why these changes are coming in, we're primarily looking at an impact in how much money VCs have and where that money is going and why it's going there. So there's been a contraction of capital with the public market decrease, with interest rates increasing. LPs are giving less money to venture, especially early stage venture. And for everyone here, I will be sharing this deck later, and it's going to have a lot more slides that are also hidden, so you all also have access to this. As we think about the fact that VCs now are getting less money, even if they have money, they now need to think about how they properly support the companies already in their portfolio and the companies that they want to invest in. Is it worth it for them to distribute their money very broadly if more money isn't coming in? Or should they be reserving capital to instead support the companies they've already invested in and make sure those investments don't go to zero? And then on top of that, and this becomes a challenge for entrepreneurs especially, the market landscape and its expectations have shifted dramatically in the last 12 months. Whereas previously, let's say you raise a big $50 million Series A, having told a great story, having strong founders, and having really good initial proof of concept. Then based on the back of that success, you go out and you've gone out, you've raised, you've told your story, you've gotten a lot of publicity, now you get a pharma partnership. Before you get that Series A today, a pharma partnership already needs to be in place. And so that shift in expectation has led to a lot of companies that were banking on previous milestone expectations to need to shift their strategies to compensate. And so as we think about, and I realize there's a difference between Japanese and US round sizes, so forgive me. This is a summary of those that are in the US. And the ranges are broad, they vary very significantly. But as you think about the early stage, pre-seed to Series A, you're going to see, on average, a lead investor put in about 50% of the round, at minimum, maybe a third. Typically, you're looking for at least 12 to 24 months of funding with each round of financing. And that way you can accomplish sufficient milestones to make it to that next stage and have achieved enough to tell that to demonstrate that you're achieving success, to get that additional validation and to move to the next part of your story. And so these amounts of capital typically enable you to do that as a biotech company that's focused in therapeutics, which is my primary area of application and interest. By way of quick summary and one additional note, there are also different types of investors at the early stage. So if you look at the right side of the slide, you see I've broken it down into your West Coast versus East Coast VCs, your tech bio versus traditionalists, and also those that are in the corporate venture space. So typically West Coast versus East Coast, West Coast is considered more founder friendly. They support early stage founders, they support first time founders, they take less equity in the company, they do a little bit less to directly interfere with the company's operations and management. Historically, East Coast founders, it's been the opposite. They either build the companies or they're very involved in how to run them, or they directly replace the founders early on or at various stages. They'll also typically and historically take considerably more equity. That said, they come with deeper pharmaceutical connections and a much deeper technical expertise. And so they're bringing that expertise to bear. Conversely, corporate venture, and for those who might be unfamiliar with what that means, it's the venture arms of large pharma companies. And those venture arms are sometimes very closely connected to the strategic priorities of the company. Other times they're entirely disconnected. And more recently, you've actually been seeing corporate venture arms being spun out and entirely separated, like with SR1 and GSK. That said, corporate VCs provide phenomenal expertise. They can be a strong market signal that a pharma company is interested. Simultaneously, this is a pharmaceutical company. They come with a degree of bureaucracy that can slow down your progress as a startup. And so it can be important to keep that in mind. They're great to have involved, but you don't always get a partnership from it. And you want to make sure that when they're engaged, they're not necessarily leading the rounds and taking a little bit too much control. That's going to slow you down. And Haruki-san, would love to invite you back up to talk a little bit more as we talk about the different types of VCs, how you should think about choosing your investors.
Yeah, sure. So I think this chart kind of represents kind of general, outset of the type of, what kind of capital they can bring in as an investor. So even if you say capital, there's, I would say, at least from the investor side, there's two kind of capital. There's a social capital, kind of network, in other words, or financial capital, basically money. So, I think kind of Chris is gonna walk you through more in detail maybe later around, but starting from friends and family, like it's kind of easy to say, like maybe they may not have a lot of social capital, depending on which family you're from, but but it's easy to get first. But if you go down to the road, it's going to be more institutional, and and you may have a broader set of social capital as well as financial capital. And another kind of, which is kind of, we created this chart, depending on the type of investors by nature. So like so there may be a passive nature, passive investor, which is they invest, but they just let it go, or active, so they want to be involved more in the operation of the company. But on the other hand, well, I would say there may be smart investor or dumb investors. Then I think the best scenario is like if you have a smart investor which is very active, that kind of bring you up to the next level, right? Which is to the successful fundraising the next round. But passive is still okay, if they, as long as they can take, they can bring money, they can you can manage that with the with the management otherwise. But this is the most tricky part. But if you pick the dumb investor, which is very active, which is basically I know is your company, and slow down everything, and you spend more time dealing with this such investor than just pursuing the development. So this is very difficult. I mean, especially for the first time entrepreneur, it's kind of tough. But that's where like Carolina said, you should ask around, ask for referral, ask for reputation. Then you'll find out which investor is the tricky one. Then you don't you can avoid stepping the mine. So with that, I think we'll turn on back to Chris. Just talk about the second point.
Thank you, Haruki-san, for rounding us off. As we think now about moving, actually, before we move forward, I wanted to actually ask for a show of hands. Who here is currently raising capital? Okay. Does anyone want to ask a question? Does anyone want to share some of the challenges you've had in that process? We can make this a conversation as well as just a presentation. Otherwise, I can keep going.
Do you mind if the questions are from a Japanese-based company that is looking to raise money in the US?
Not in the slightest.
If it's in this case, how would we do that if most US VCs that I've talked to before, they want us to be operating in the Bay Area instead of in Japan, even though we are a Delaware C Corp?
So I'm assuming you're an early stage company at this point? Oh, okay. I would say, and this is going to be a question I suspect everyone here has, which is how do you attract US investment as a Japanese company, especially one operating in Japan? And it's a question that I wish I could give you an answer to and say, this is the magic bullet, do this, and it'll do these three things, and you can attract US investors. Unfortunately, that's going to be a bit difficult. There are going to be firms that invest and operate more internationally. And we're going to get into next not only elements of what you should think about when it comes to pitching your story, but when we get to point 3, we're going to talk about ways of building a targeted investor list. And as you look at companies that firms that invest in companies around the world, I had a couple thoughts as I tried to come up with an answer to this question. And the first is that it might be difficult to go directly to, say, Foresight in the Bay Area and ask them for an investment, especially because Foresight invests almost entirely domestically. However, there are other firms that also, say, have offices in Cambridge and in Singapore, or that are investing very actively right now in places like Australia, or like Shiming, who have a number of regional LPs from the area, or Xeon Ventures, which is led primarily by LPs based in Japan. And so as you do your homework and have a deeper understanding of where different firms are focused, where their capital is coming from, what they're prioritizing, having an understanding of who you work with and how you can build those relationships is going to be important, because there are currently around 3,000 VC firms. That number is unfortunately dwindling given the current market conditions. And I was talking to a very senior partner in the space about 2 weeks ago, who was saying before all this is over, he wouldn't be surprised if there are less than 2,000 VC firms by the time things shake out. So VCs are struggling right now, just as everyone is. And as you think about how do you reach out to people who are facing their own challenges, who already have a lot of noise, it's going to be really important to understand where they focus, what they care about, and how to best match, which I know really doesn't answer to your question because I'm sure you're doing that anyway, but.
So let me add a few words from the legal perspective and kind of experience from dealing with clients. So I think I can say 2 things. So one is like, Chris mentioned, so you don't want to, you can't just go to directly, so for example, pure like a US venture firm. So that's why I guess, the Axel here, Remage is here. But there's a number of, VC which have like a footprint both in Japan and US or other part of the world. So you should take advantage of those connections. Then the network will spread to the more, more pure like a US firm or European firm. That's kind of one thing. And also, you need to also make sure, I think it was kind of Mark O'Horison's comments, but you should step on the shoes on the other side, right? Also, always. So if you are, for example, if you're a Japanese company, so not all the VCs are familiar with, for example, venture terms in Japan. And sometimes you need to kind of, rectify those issues to make it compatible with the kind of, more venture terms, which is more applicable globally. Or sometimes if you think, you have a better chance of exiting like in the different, for example, NASDAQ or, selling to other European or American pharma, then you may actually think about like converting your company from a Japanese corporation to like a Delaware corporation, etc. So that it's a kind of not just, it's kind of a tough decision to make right now, but there's a way to kind of think about it.
Yeah, and if I'm actually going to chime in real quick. Hi, my name is Anastasia. I'm a co-founder with Chris and OneBio. I actually come from growth equity investing, and one of the operational partners that we had at Gilda Healthcare Partners in the EU and the US was Japanese. Her name is Mika Nishimura. And my recommendation there is to actually find operational partners in firms who might not necessarily be invested in Japan yet, but who might have an interest in investing in Japan, and get your foot in the door through those operational partners, because they have the experience in Japan that the firms are really going to seek to understand the space. And to comment here, yes, a US-based fund is going to want to see your company operate in the United States, or an EU-based fund is going to want to see your company operate in the EU, because that would typically be their bread and butter, is those areas. So yeah, hope that helps.
Thank you both. And I hope that at least begins to answer your question, though I'm sure there's more we can talk about. Were there any others before we continue? Or did anyone want to build off that? All right, let's keep it moving in the interest of time. As a VC, what do I look for? There, in short, is a lot to consider. And as every founder in the room knows, as every investor in the room knows, there's a lot more than just what's here. But what it really comes down to are the four elements that Hiroki-san mentioned earlier: the team, the market, the science, and who are the other investors around the table. And there's a changing order of priority depending on the stage of your company in the way I consider each of those elements. At the early stage, without any hesitation, I can tell you first and foremost, team is the most important to me. From there, we'll look at the market, then the science, and then the other co-investors. Though, to be fair, there's a minimum bar that needs to be kept for me to be interested at all. As we think about the team, it often really comes down to the founders or founder. What is that individual or those individuals' profiles? Do they have the balanced mix of technical and business acumen to build a company and bring it forward? Do they have a demonstrated fearlessness, as Carolina mentioned, and then also determination? Do they have the right network? Do they have the right reputation? Have they demonstrated an ability to learn, to be determined? And taking it a step forward, do I want to work with them? As an investor coming in with a company, this is a 5, if not 10-year commitment. Do I want to be partnered with you for 10 years? It's an important question, and it's also one you should be asking, because when it comes down to this, it's a two-way street. And then there's also something at our fund that we like to call the Frank test. So Frank Nestle is the chief scientific officer of Sanofi, which was also mentioned earlier. And I have a cell phone number. I can text him, and if I text him, he'll take a meeting with you next week. But am I going to make that introduction? Are you someone who, if I put in front of Frank, he'll take the next meeting? Keep that in mind, because who you are, you can be older, you can be younger, you can be a first-time founder, you can be a serial entrepreneur. If I can't put you in front of Frank, none of that matters to me. As we start thinking about the market itself, the reason market, at least in the beginning, is second most important is because as an early stage company, you're almost certainly going to have to pivot at one point or another. Something's going to change. The odds of everything working out perfectly in bio as you move forward, as everyone in this room knows, almost non-existent. And so as you think about that, you need to have a market that's flexible enough to be able to adapt with you, just as you need to be a founder who can adapt with those changes. And then as you think about the market more broadly from a financial perspective, it also has to be large enough to justify VC investment, which is why you often see more investment made in the therapeutic space as opposed to tools companies, service companies, diagnostics companies. Thinking about the science, here there always needs to be a minimum bar, and what we look for at each stage varies. It also varies depending on the type of company, and it varies depending on really the timelines required. And so a rough rule of thumb is you can be looking at in vitro work at the pre-seed and seed, in vivo work at the seed Series A. Your IND should come somewhere between, I've seen it anywhere from seed to Series B, and then in the clinic, starting at the Series A moving forward, I'd love to see some sort of validation there. And this is going to come up a couple times, as mentioned already, though. When you're talking about the science, you really need to be able to tell that story around it well. And then finally, why do I put on here the other investors? Because just as I want to work with you for 10 years, I want to work with them for 10 years. And sometimes I know an investor is going to give advice I'm really going to disagree with. And if they're your lead investor, they're sitting on your board and they have an ability to choose partly how your company is run, but that's not the way I think your company should be run, then I'm going to think twice about whether or not I want to be directly involved. Because if I have to spend half of my time explaining why the advice someone else who was on your board is given is a bad idea, that's not a productive use of my time either. At the Series A and at the Series B, actually, things start to change and the science becomes more important because at that point, the team should be a little bit more figured out. But the team is still growing. And so at that stage, team still matters a little bit more than market because while your market should be, while you should have defined your market a bit more as you've advanced your company, as you've brought people on, as you've explored partnerships, potentially brought on customers, your team is still going to have a couple gaps. Maybe you're not in the clinic yet and you need to hire a CMO. Maybe you're still exploring who to bring on from a chief business officer perspective, and they're going to be the ones who really run point on partnerships or customer acquisitions. But at this stage, it's science, team, market. And then at the Series B, it's science, market, team. Because as you get later, the financial opportunity and the commercial opportunity is going to matter a lot more, and the team should be more established and have a little bit more flexibility if there does need to be a change. One of our highest performing companies right now is without a CEO and has been for over 12 months. They're at the Series B, and yet they're doing absolutely phenomenally in the clinic. And why is this possible? Because the CSO and founder has the expertise to step into that role in the interim while they run a search to find the right person to come on. And that's actually going to be a side point, but something to consider here. Anytime you're looking to bring on an executive or any key hire in the team, start at least 6 months in advance because finding the right person takes a while. So while there's a lot to consider, what does this all come down to? It comes down to how do you tell the story of all of it together? And as you think about those ways to tell your story, and we touched on this briefly in the beginning, there are a couple that are going to be important. I'd love to be able to hear in 1 or 2 sentences from every person pitching in this room, and I know we're going to have a number of pitches shortly. In 1 or 2 sentences, roughly, what do you do and why is it important or why does it matter? Going back to the example of our portfolio company earlier, Mythic, they have a supercharged conditional activation for ADCs. As a result, they're able to far more effectively target solely cancer cells, and in doing so, minimize toxicity while also greatly increasing the number of patients who are able to receive the benefit from those therapeutics. Basically, the original promise of ADCs. And so that's a quick description of a very complex company. Can you each do the same? And then can you dial that up? If that's enough to interest me or any other investor here, can you expand on that? What are the most important points? Where do you come from? Who are you as founders? What is the team size right now? Where are you based? Why does this matter? Because sometimes, even though we might be investors, there's going to be a lot we don't know too. I'm not an expert in every space. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in really many spaces. So help us as you move forward, just as you help people in your company. Carolina talked about evangelism, so I can skip over that here. But let's now talk about, we've talked about what investors are looking for. Let's talk a little bit about the order of events. We talked about building that target list, getting the warm intro that Carolina mentioned, having a non-confidential deck to share, and then walking through a first meeting. I'll go through each of those points in a little more detail. Then at that point, you have your NDA. Hopefully you have a strong confidential deck, built out a data room, and you start diving deep. And then ideally move towards a term sheet discussion. So what's the process of contacting me? Because as I mentioned, I get way too many notifications. The first point is how to build that target list. And something you'll see on the bottom left that we put out into the ecosystem through our content platform, BIOS, is a list of 100 tech bio VC funds. It includes personal contacts of many of the partners at those firms. It also includes what they invest in, where they're based, and the stages they invest. And while these resources and this information isn't always clear, you should hopefully be able to find at least some of it out there and be able to understand by looking at investor websites, the types of companies they invest in. So really do your homework up front. Understand what a VC's priorities are, because every once in a while, I'll get a random investment ask for something in real estate. That's not particularly fitting. So keep in mind who you're reaching out to And don't just spray an investment out there. And that goes to the second point, which is the introductory email. Ideally, you're getting a warm introduction. You've reached out to other founders in your network. You've contacted operating partners. You're in touch with academics who might have done previous work or might have helped build a company with a venture creation firm. You're finding a way in. Finding a way to me through someone I already know is a demonstration to me of your resilience, your determination, and the fact that you're doing that little bit of extra homework that's honestly so critical for a founder. Then from there, I would include in the email itself 1 to 2 paragraphs. That short introduction we were just talking about. I'd have a longer supplement at the bottom of the email that if I read that first paragraph and I'm saying, oh, this is really cool, then yeah, I want to read that longer supplement. But if it's a 10-paragraph email right from the beginning, that's too long. I'm on to the next one. Not really, I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean. And then as you think about establishing those connections and specific points for Japan, it might also be worth including a supplement if you're reaching out to US investors on exactly that topic. Why should they be considering investing in a Japanese company? What are some of the advantages from the regulatory landscape, from the financial side with regards to, let's be frank, the currency conversion at the moment, and then also the fact that round sizes tend to be a bit smaller here? All of these could be advantages to consider and keep in mind. And then during that first meeting, hopefully, you have already given them a teaser with the deck, with the email. You want to set the right tone. You want to have anywhere from a 10-minute to a 30-minute presentation, because sometimes I have 30 minutes to chat with you, sometimes I have an hour. And if that's the case, you need to be able to flexibly adapt to both. On top of that, you want to make sure you're covering the scientific proposition, the business proposition, who you are, what you're asking for, and why. And if you can, really try to get some clear feedback. Save 5 minutes at the end, no matter what it is, to try and not only understand what they thought, why they thought it, but also ask what other questions they might have, what else you can follow up with to share. And if possible, is there the potential for that second meeting? And if so, try to schedule it with them live, because it's much easier to do that if possible and say, oh, would love to reconnect with you in a couple of weeks. When might be best for you? I have these times. Does that work? Doesn't always happen, but if it's possible, it's always great to have that little bit of urgency and pressure to keep the conversation moving. I'm going to skip this just in the interest of time. The data room here, you can also look through. Term sheet negotiations, the same. But something I did want to think about and consider, have everyone consider, is the fact that you should always be thinking about your next round of financing. And this is something that even in the US and even among our colleagues is not often done. But let's say you've just finished your seed round. You raised a successful $6 million, and that's about to keep you going for 18 to 24 months. You have a couple goals in mind that you conveyed to your investors. What is one of the first things you should do? You should meet with each of those investors and confirm in detail you're considering those milestones for that round. So that way you know what their thoughts are on what you're trying to complete, and you're making sure that if you complete them, that all makes sense to invest in that next round. They'll each step up if they can. Then you want to work with those investors to craft a list of 20 and 30 Series A investors. Who are the people you want to ideally lead or potentially syndicate at your next stage of investment? Go to each of those investors, get a warm introduction from your current investors, and tell them, hey, these are the milestones we're considering. This is how we're thinking about building the company and what we hope to accomplish in the next 1 to 2 years. If we achieve these things, would that be of interest to you? Sometimes they'll say yes, sometimes they'll offer feedback. Do that with 20 or 30 people. You continue to refine your own business plan and business strategy. And then once you know, oh, this firm is really interested in our next round, perfect. With each of these people, stay in touch. Every 3 months, every 6 months, send them an investor update, just like you would to the people who have invested in you already. Tell them, look, we said we're going out to accomplish this. We're achieving that, and ideally more. And then at the end, 2 years later, at that point, you already agreed what you were going to do. Ideally, you've accomplished it. You've kept it going and kept them informed along the way. At that point, it's just paperwork. ideally. And having run this process now with 8 or 9 of our portfolio companies, each of them has been able to achieve an oversubscribed next round. So it's something I would strongly recommend and strongly consider. I can touch on this briefly as well, but as we think about some of the fundraising mistakes, there are a number we've already gone through. So the first is insufficient investor research. Don't send me a real estate presentation. There's the fact that diligence is that two-way street. There are some firms that are known for being better than others, and that goes back to what I was saying about wanting them as co-investors, wanting them on the board. There are also, and as has been mentioned, don't ask me for an NDA before I've even seen a presentation. As you think about slightly more nuanced elements, there are, for example, considerations around fund life cycle. If I've already deployed the vast majority of capital I have available in this fund, then it's going to be more difficult for me to try and invest in you as a company, no matter how much I might like to. Similarly, we're going to go out and we're going to do reference checks on you as founders. Do the same for us. Ask for an introduction to several of our portfolio companies. See how we are and how we operate with our founders. And finally, as you think about all of this, plan to be a bit flexible in terms of your investment structure. This was also included in the slide we passed over briefly on term sheet negotiations. But as you think about your audience, you rarely, unless you have a very strong value proposition, you know exactly what you're looking for, and you are running a highly competitive process with many interested investors around the table. It's often best if I ask you the question, what are you thinking about raising? To say something along the lines of, well, obviously we're going to let the market decide and we'd love your input. However, based on our current milestones, how much we think we'll need to raise to get there, we're thinking we need, let's say, $3 to $5 million for these primary activities. And as a result, that will get us to that next stage. Does that make sense based on your experience? Make it a conversation and make it clear that you're intending to have a conversation from the beginning. And finally, before I open it up for questions, just a very brief personal message and point I'd like to share, which is that if you're here today, you've made a pretty active choice to be part of the bio community. And so for the rest of today's session and for the rest of your careers, something I hope you can keep in mind is that there really is rarely one correct answer. Instead, information is almost always incomplete in bio. There's always one more experiment you can do. So the majority of questions you're going to ask, the answer is probably going to be, it depends, as Carolina was saying, on the type of company, on your individual situation, on the broader market. And so instead, try to build a diverse team of complementary skill sets. Try to bring on advisors who can offer guidance for your current, but also your next stage. Try to remember that you have biases. You should always check. And keep in mind, we're all in this space, I like to think, and I like to hope, because we want to help other people. We got into bio to make the world a little bit of a better place. So one, let's all support each other and let's keep trying. And with that, I'll say thank you and open it up for questions. And for context, that was 87 of 190 slides. So there's a lot here that you can all look into later. We will.
Available, right? Yeah. So that should be available.
Yes,
Aware.
we will, later on, I'll introduce you the BioJent online community, where we'll invite all of you to join, where we'll put all the recordings from today and also from the other things that we are doing. So you'll have all the materials there.
Yeah. So and one thing I just want to add in terms of diligence of investors, especially kind of important for in the Japanese community. So because especially in the seed round, because the kind of the volume of angel investors pretty small, right? So compared to US, and sometimes some angel investors is considered, well, they found to be considered as a so-called anti-social force, a hansha. So like a anti-yakuza or someone somehow related. So which you may not know. So, but that's in our experience in some of the startup company, facing these issues when they, accepting the VC money, because Japanese VC found out like, oh, here's this number of angel investors. They have this kind of reputation or history. Then they had to go through the cleaning up or the, kind of cap table, how to buy out those, the shares from those, early investors. It was a mess. So actually, it's actually importance of diligence actually starting from the beginning. So that's what I want to emphasize, especially, Japanese market.
I would strongly second that. I was actually advising a friend recently who was spinning a company out of MIT, and I was offering a lot of advice on how he needed to clean up the cap table, because having a dozen investors who owned various percentages was not going to go well when they tried to raise that first institutional round from VCs. So yes, there are often going to be circumstances where you're starting up a company. I don't have $500,000 to do so. I don't know how many people in this room do either, if you're an early stage founder. But that being the case, try to, when you bring on angels, try to be mindful of what the expectations are going to be down the line as well. And don't overdo promises around convertible securities or convertible debt. Try to be relatively conservative, and also remember your future potential, not just your current position.
Thank you so much for like all the insightful speech. My question is probably to Caroline, okay, if it's okay. But like with all the options, like a fundraising options as well as out licensing options, and I think there are always multiple options to monetize, to get some funds to keep the company going. And then what is like your thought process in terms of when and which way the company will make a commitment to, for example, like out licensing a therapeutic asset, and if they out license it, and it will no longer be the companies, it can be the partners. And if fundraising is more feasible option, they might want to keep going on their own to advance their own therapeutic asset. So I would like to, I'm curious about your thought process, and frankly speaking, like everybody's perspective on like how to make a commitment to like one way of the monetizing activity.
Well, I think that, as Chris said, it depends. So if I'm in a startup and I have an asset and I have to decide whether to out-license the asset or do a co-development or fundraising, I think I will try the three of them and see where I get the best return of investment. It's funny, but fundraising and business development goes hand in hand. So while you are doing what I was doing when I was in Jazz, for example, I did fundraising for the company. I was doing fundraising, I was doing business development and fundraising at the same time. And let me explain this. I was doing, so the business model was doing a service. Basically, we were offering drug discovery and development for startups, for biologics. So I will go to a VC fund and I will talk with a partner and I will say, we are raising money. And if he will say, well, I'm not interested or whatever, or we will see, I will say, well, by the way, you have all these startups in your portfolio. All of these I have checked because I've done my research, like Chris said. All of these need support because they are biologics, they are antibodies or biospecific or tetraspecifics, and they need support on drug discovery, development, and manufacturing. And my company does that. So can you introduce me to your company so I work with them? And actually, you will be surprised. They like that a lot because they say, oh, she's very resourceful. Like she came here, she already tried to do business with our portfolio. So she's gonna do business no matter what. So she's a good candidate for me to put the money. So VCs are looking at, I'm gonna give you $1. I want to make sure that you are gonna make 10 for me. That's what is in their mind. Sorry, I know that this is very harsh, but That has been my
That's very
experience,
true.
right? So you have to be certainly aggressive in a way that they see you that you are gonna make that money for them. So if your decision is, do I out-license these assets? Do I co-development with a pharma? Do I raise money? Try to see the three of them and try to see what you get back as a feedback, and then iterate in that decision, right? You have to talk with lots of people. You have to lose your voice, literally. So that will be my advice. I know it depends, and I know it's not a straight answer, but that's what I will do.
I would strongly second that. And I would also say you can then begin to play those options off each other. So if you have the potential to explore all three, you should. And simultaneously, you should also try to understand if they're each going to complement the other. Let's say you have an option to out-license, but only in a specific geography, or co-develop in another geography. If you bring that to me as an investor and you tell me, look, we're going to have a $10 million term sheet from Sanofi for an early stage milestone, as an early stage milestone payment, that's great. That's capital efficiency for me. That's de-risking. And so that's a way to know that, similarly, if you go to a pharma company and you say, we're in the process of closing a large Series A round that's going to ensure we're in a strong position to execute on these milestones, as one of our portfolio companies is doing with a top 5 pharma company now. That puts them in a strong position as a pharma company to know that, yes, despite being a seed stage company, they are going to be around and they're going to have the capital to keep working with us. And so if we're investing that time in the partnership, it's important. So not only should you pursue each path, you should also share, at least in part, some of the salient points with the other negotiators around the table. So that way you're running a competitive process, even as you would just within and among VCs, for example. And I actually also wanted, and Carolina, thank you for mentioning this because it brings it back to top of mind for me. A no is rarely a full no. Just come back to me 6 months later, tell me what you've accomplished, tell me you have a new lead investor. You have no idea how often venture capitalists will come out of everywhere as soon as you have a lead. And it's really unfortunate, but there are, especially at the early stage, there are very few true lead firms. And so keeping that in mind and keeping channels of communication open, respectfully, don't spam, but at the same time, reach out every few weeks in the beginning, every few months later on, share an update, express that you appreciated a point of feedback, express a milestone you've accomplished, a paper you've published, a customer received, a partnership developed, a key new hire that's going to help advance your technology in one way or another. Have those lines and those channels of communication open. So instead of coming back to me 24 months later when you're raising a next round, I have that familiarity. You have been top of mind because I'm continuing to see those updates. And then that puts you in a stronger position. Similarly, I would also say if a no is a no right now, say, I understand. Thank you for letting me know. Do you have friends in your investor network for whom this might be a better fit? And also try to get those connections as well. Because honestly, the name of the game here is networking as much as it is anything else. Yeah.
I would say like which one you feel better or happy would be the way to go.
Fair point. You have to live with your decisions too, so keep that in mind.
Here's a question. I got it.
So I have a question to Chris. So we as a early stage company seeking a Series A fundraising for 20 million. So now I'm actively searching for the lead investor in Japan or in the US. So we are currently in the Japan headquarter company, but are thinking to transfer to the US. So this is the option. But as you mentioned, that's HSBC bank mentioned that it's currently the venture funders, they face very tough circumstances in 2023. And yeah, when I heard the presentation from the HSBC, that in the pre-COVID area, pre-COVID era, they invest 70% for the new company and 30% for the existing, but now 50-50. But 50 for the
Would
new,
even
the 50
possibly say less.
less, really. So in that case, what is the 2024? So in your perspective?
The honest answer might not be positive, but I will give it to you. If you look at Carta, which is one of the leading startup management softwares and websites, there have been more startups closed this quarter than any in Carta's history before this. I'm expecting Q1 and Q2 to unfortunately continue with that trend as investors decide, and to an extent have decided, which companies they are going to keep investing in from their existing portfolio, and unfortunately with those they will not be able to continue to financially support. And so there have been a large number of companies that are making it through 2023 either by minimizing operations, cutting headcounts, or on short-term financial extensions to their capital, bridge rounds. Those are going to run out in Q1 and Q2. And so the startup landscape is going to continue to shrink, even as the VC landscape continues to shrink. That said, with the shrinking of the number of opportunities in terms of old investments and portfolio companies to support, because a lot of firms right now are not choosing to do as many insider-led rounds. They can only lead so many internal portfolio companies. That will start to free up capital to explore and expand their investment pipeline more broadly, especially for firms that do have money. They're going to need to invest it. And there have been firms that are able to raise. Luma just started with over 300 million. I'm sure everyone's seen Orbital and RA, and while they might not do as much in the early stage, the Series A does fall to an extent within their Orbital's wheelhouse, for example. And so there are companies and firms that are going to start to align. My expectation for 2024 is that a lot of capital, especially based on LP interests at the moment, is going to focus around the Series B and Series C stage. Because the early stage environment is marked by, has to compete with the fact that there's inflation. So if you're looking at a 10-year investment horizon, it's going to be difficult to make a pre-seed bet. Similarly, and this has been quite interesting, if you're too late and you can exit in a very short timeline, LPs don't want the tax implications right now. And so they're looking for that mid spot at the more Series B, Series C, which is also where there are a lot of opportunities with companies that are advancing pretty strong assets. And then for other savvy investors, they're also focused in the public markets, where the XBI right now is very depressed, but there are still some really strong companies out there with good clinical portfolios. And so that's been, at least from what I'm seeing, the primary areas of focus. I will say that the best companies will be able to raise regardless. You're starting to see more academic spinouts begin to occur again. And there has been sort of a consolidation of the market in the last 12 months. So as things start to settle, it does look like firms are going to begin investing in 24. I just can't tell you how strongly across the board. But at least that's what I'm seeing. I'd be curious to hear from anyone else in the venture space if that aligns, or if they're seeing something different.
So let's have that conversation over our break, because I think we're out of time for this session. But thanks to Chris and Sugita-san and Carolina for that session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
So I actually stole your last break, but this break you can have. So 10 minutes, and we'll be doing the pitch. If I could ask the judges to just come up here at the front to consult. So yeah, so if I can ask Taro and Shin and Mori-san and also Ishi-san to come up here in the front.